This piece was built across many unhurried hours, combing through records, weighing every word, and returning again and again to the details until they felt right. Nothing landed here by accident. Every choice was deliberate, made in service of a single goal: to hold the listener in a space that is both immersive and considered, where difficult events are met with the gravity they have always deserved. At its heart, this channel was created for one reason alone: to make sure these stories are not lost. Not swallowed by time, not buried beneath the relentless noise of everything else competing for your attention. These are real events involving real people, and they deserve to be carried forward, told carefully and remembered. Before Brazil ever learned to name the darkness that stalked its streets, the darkness had already chosen its victims, claimed its silence, and vanished back into the crowd. And nobody, not a single soul, saw it coming from a quiet, aging drifter with hollow eyes and hands that had already touched death. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the devil that walked among human, the untold horror of Brazil's first serial killer. This is the case of José Augusto do Amaral, a.k.a. Preto Amaral, a.k.a. the Black Devil of São Paulo. Now let's begin. Picture a city buzzing with the noise of the living, market vendors calling out from dusty corners, children chasing each other between colonial buildings, the smell of coffee and rain-soaked cobblestone rising into a warm São Paulo morning. Now imagine that somewhere beneath that warmth, beneath that ordinary noise, a man is walking. He is not young. He is not rushing. He looks like every other forgotten soul the city has swallowed. Worn shoes, no fixed address, surviving on scraps of labor and the invisibility that poverty grants. But this man carries something no one in Brazil has ever cataloged before, something no law enforcement agency in the entire country has ever tracked or named. He carries a compulsion so violent, so deeply buried beneath a calm exterior, that by the time the bodies begin appearing near the outskirts of the city, near the flat open ground surrounding the Campo de Marte airfield, the newspapers will scramble for language strong enough to describe what he left behind. They will settle on 2 names: O Monstro Negro, the Black Monster, and O Diabo Negro, the Black Devil. Both will send the city of São Paulo into collective terror. Both will be printed across front pages in ink so dark it seems to bleed. And yet, the man behind both names will never face a courtroom. He will never hear a verdict read aloud. He will slip through justice's fingers in the most final way imaginable, taking everything he knew with him to the grave. This is the story of José Augusto do Amaral, considered the first serial killer in Brazilian history. A man whose guilt remains disputed even now, whose confession was extracted through torture, and whose legacy sits in a crime museum in the very city he allegedly terrorized. Whatever the truth of his crimes, what happened in São Paulo between 1926 and 1927 shook the nation to its foundation, forced a reckoning with violence no one was prepared for, and opened a door in Brazilian criminal history that would never fully close again. Tonight, we go through that door. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There is a version of José Augusto do Amaral's story that is deeply human before it becomes anything else. Born in 1871 in Conquista, in the inland state of Minas Gerais, he entered a world that had already decided what his life would look like before he drew his first breath. His parents were enslaved people. His father's lineage traced to the Congo, his mother's to Mozambique, and the Brazil of his earliest years was still a nation in which human beings were bought and sold as commodities. José Augusto do Amaral was born into chains he could not see but would feel pressing against him for the rest of his life. That was the Brazil that shaped him. He was 17 years old when Princess Isabel signed the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law, on May 13, 1888, abolishing slavery throughout the Brazilian Empire. For Amaral, as for hundreds of thousands of others freed by that single stroke of a pen, the moment of liberation carried a devastating companion: absolute uncertainty. Freedom had arrived without a map. There were no reparations, no land grants, no formal pathways into economic stability. Formerly enslaved people were set adrift into a society that did not want them, did not plan for them, and would not accommodate them. They were free to starve, free to wander, free to disappear into the margins of a country that had spent centuries defining their humanity as property. Amaral did what many young men with no options and no prospects did. He joined the army. Military service gave him structure: beds, meals, orders, a uniform, a daily rhythm. For a young man who had never owned anything, it provided a kind of belonging, however conditional. He served in multiple cities across Brazil, moving with battalions from post to post, learning the landscape of his country not through choice but through assignment. And somewhere along those years of service, something began fracturing. He disappeared from his battalion not once but multiple times. The details of these disappearances remain murky, recorded only in fragments of bureaucratic language that offer no emotional texture, no explanation. He simply vanished, then reappeared, then vanished again. Each time there were consequences: disciplinary actions, reinstatements, eventually an arrest that resulted in a stint behind bars, though the specific charges from that period are lost to time. What this pattern tells us, even across nearly a century of distance, is that Amaral was never stable. He was a man perpetually slipping out from under whatever structure attempted to hold him. The army could not contain him. The law could not hold him for long. Society had no real place for him. And so he drifted. By the mid-1920s, when he was well into his 50s, José Augusto do Amaral was a wanderer surviving on casual labor, the odd job here, the errand there, the handout when nothing else materialized. He moved through São Paulo like smoke, present but formless, noticed by no one, registered nowhere. São Paulo in the 1920s was a city transforming at a speed that overwhelmed its own infrastructure. The coffee economy had made it prosperous. European immigrants were pouring in by the hundreds of thousands. Factories were rising. The city was loud and chaotic and full of people moving so fast they rarely looked down at the man sleeping beneath the bridge or pushing a cart through the pre-dawn silence. Amaral was invisible in this city, and invisibility, for a man carrying whatever he carried inside him, is not a refuge. It is a permission. He was 55 years old. He had lived a life of poverty, marginalization, and institutional failure. He had no home, no family on record, no community that would miss him on a given night. Whatever had been burning inside him for decades, suppressed, redirected, survived, was, by 1926, apparently no longer suppressible. The city of São Paulo was about to learn what it meant to have something truly dangerous moving through its streets, something it had no framework to understand, no category to place it in, no name ready for it. The word serial killer did not yet exist in the Portuguese language or in Brazilian law. There were murderers, certainly. There were criminals of all kinds in a city this large and this turbulent. But the concept of a single individual killing multiple victims in a pattern, driven by compulsion rather than conflict or profit, was something the Brazilian criminal justice system of 1926 was entirely unprepared to confront. The bodies would force them to confront it anyway. Somewhere in the outer stretches of São Paulo, in the flat, open land near what is today known as Campo de Marte Airport, the ground was about to receive its first secret. A secret placed there by hands that belonged to a quiet, aging drifter whom nobody had thought to watch. The city did not yet know his name. The newspapers had not yet named him anything. The police had no file on him in connection with violence of this nature. But that was about to change. Dramatically, brutally, and permanently. The year was 1926. The first victim was 27 years old. And whatever happened to him in the final moments of his life was so severe, so far beyond what the city's investigators had ever encountered, that when they finally found him, when the body was discovered near the airfield, lying in a manner that no accident or ordinary crime could explain, The officers who responded did not immediately know what they were looking at. They knew it was a man. They knew he was dead. Beyond that, the scene spoke in a language that required translation, required a framework, required a name for a kind of predator that Brazil had not yet acknowledged existed within its borders. The investigation that followed would be slow, clumsy, conducted by institutions unequipped for what they had stumbled into. It would take more deaths before the machinery of panic set in. It would take the newspapers getting involved, screaming from their front pages with the breathless alarm that sells papers and terrifies cities, before the public fully understood that something was hunting young men in their streets. And even then, even at the height of the terror, the man they were looking for was still walking freely, still invisible, still surviving on odd jobs and shadows, still apparently searching for his next victim. The city of São Paulo had never met a man like José Augusto do Amaral. It was not ready for him. And in the gap between what the city expected from its criminals and what Amaral actually was, young men lost their lives in ways that the surviving records describe with clinical detachment, but that, when translated into human reality, represent some of the most violent and violating acts imaginable. What drove him remains, even now, genuinely unknown. There was no trial at which a prosecution could lay out a motive. There was no defense attorney who argued an alternative. There was a confession, yes, but it came from a man who had been tortured by the very officers assigned to discover the truth. How much of what Amaral said in that interrogation room was memory, and how much was pain speaking, remains one of the most uncomfortable questions attached to this entire case. But before we arrive at the arrest, before we arrive at the confession and the controversy that surrounds it, we must first walk through the horror itself. We must follow the trail of victims. We must stand, as much as the historical record allows us to stand, at the scenes where lives were ended and bodies were left in ways that would haunt São Paulo's collective imagination for generations. Because that is the story, not just the monster, but the human cost. The young men who had names, ages, futures, and who were reduced in the newspapers of the time to evidence, to cases, to proof that something terrible lived among the living. The flat scrubland near the Campo de Marte airfield sat on the northern edge of São Paulo in the 1920s. Not quite city, not quite countryside, an in-between place where the noise of urban life thinned out and the open sky pressed down without obstruction. Laborers passed through it. The destitute camped near its edges. It was the kind of place that swallowed things quietly, where a sound could dissolve into open air before anyone nearby thought to question it. This is where the first body was found. He was 27 years old. That is nearly all the historical record gives us about him as a person. His age, and the manner in which he died, which the forensic documentation of the time recorded in language so clinical it strips the horror to its bare mechanics. He had been strangled. The manner of his death indicated a direct, manual assault. The kind that requires closeness, physical dominance, and a willingness to maintain that intimacy until life entirely leaves the body beneath your hands. Strangulation is not a crime of distance. It is sustained. It is deliberate. The killer must remain present through every second of it, through the struggle, through the weakening, through the absolute stillness at the end. After death, the young man had been violated. The nature of that violation, the sequence of strangulation followed by sexual assault on the body, placed this crime in a category that São Paulo's investigators had no established protocol for. The available forensic science of 1920s Brazil was far from advanced, and the understanding of what drives an individual to harm in this particular sequence was virtually non-existent in the local criminal literature. The officers who processed the scene were trained for robbery, for crimes of passion, for gang violence, for the ordinary brutality of a large, impoverished city. They were not trained for this. The body was documented. The case was opened, and São Paulo continued moving at its roaring pace. The factories, the markets, the immigrants, the construction. As it always did, absorbing tragedy as large cities do, without pause. Then came the second victim. The pattern was identical in its essential elements. A young man, lured or encountered under circumstances that remain speculative, brought to an isolated location, strangled into death, and then subjected to violation after death. The geography was similar, the open edges of the city, places where the ground did not ask questions. The victim profile was consistent in what the era's newspapers described cautiously and incompletely, but the pattern was clear enough that investigators began connecting what they initially treated as isolated incidents. Two young men, two similar scenes, both strangled, both discovered in open ground on the city's outskirts. The method too consistent to be coincidence. The São Paulo newspapers, which at this time operated with the fevered energy of a press culture that had discovered sensationalism as a commercial tool, began printing what investigators were carefully avoiding saying aloud. There was someone in the city doing this more than once. Someone who was going to do it again. The coverage was incendiary. The language of the era's journalism did not practice restraint. It practiced alarm. The words chosen in those front pages were designed to provoke maximum fear, maximum readership, maximum visceral response. The unknown perpetrator was described in terms that conjured something barely human. The city's imagination, fed daily by breathless reporting, constructed a figure of monstrous proportion lurking in the shadows beyond the lamplight. And then there was a third victim, the same pattern, the same deliberate, controlled method of killing. The same post-mortem violation that indicated not chaos, not rage in the fleeting sense, but something more structured and more disturbing, a compulsion that the killing itself only partially satisfied. The location, again, was peripheral, ground that offered concealment and distance from witnesses. The victim, again, was a young man. 3 deaths, 1 pattern, 1 city growing more terrified with each new headline. But there was also something else. Something that would eventually crack the case open in the most unexpected way. There was a survivor. At some point during the killing period, Amaral allegedly attempted to draw another young man into his orbit, approaching with some kind of offer or ruse. The historical record is not fully explicit about the nature of the approach, but the outcome is clear. The young man became frightened. Something in the exchange triggered alarm. He fled. He ran before whatever was intended for him could unfold, and he ran far enough, fast enough, that Amaral could not retrieve him. And this man, this unnamed, terrified young man who trusted his instincts in a moment where instinct was the only available protection, went to the police. His report was a thread. A small, fragile thread connecting something real and breathing to the growing pile of evidence that something very wrong was happening in São Paulo. He described the encounter. He described the man. The details he provided, imperfect, shaped by the chaos of near escape, were nonetheless enough to generate a direction for investigation that the physical evidence alone had not provided. The police had a description. Not yet a name, not yet a face to match precisely, but a direction. An approximate age, a physical presence, a behavioral pattern. An older man, approaching young men, using some form of proposition or deception to establish proximity before the situation shifted into danger. This was the portrait of a predator who operated through false intimacy, through the establishment of a transient trust that he then demolished completely. He was not attacking strangers from behind or in bursts of public violence. He was building brief, controlled situations in which the victim did not recognize the threat until escape was either impossible or, in this one survivor's case, barely achievable. What the survivor's report confirmed, beyond its investigative value, was that Amaral's methods had an element of selection and approach that implied experience. This was not a man who had stumbled into violence and repeated it by accident. The pattern of approach, the choice of location, the consistency of method. These pointed to a man who understood, on some level, what he was doing and how to do it without detection. How many times had he done it successfully before those 3 confirmed victims were found? The suspected victim count ranges as high as 8. The confirmed count is 3. Between those numbers sits an uncomfortable expanse of uncertainty. The possibility that the Campo de Marte airfield and the surrounding outer ground of São Paulo concealed more than investigators ever fully recovered. The city's geography worked in Amaral's favor. The outskirts of São Paulo in the 1920s were not mapped with precision. Bodies that ended up in the wrong stretch of open ground might never be found, or might be found so long after death that the evidence connecting them to a specific perpetrator was gone. São Paulo was also a city swollen with arriving migrants, travelers, people with no fixed local community, individuals whose absence might not be reported promptly, if at all. A laborer from the interior who came to the city for work and vanished might simply be presumed to have moved on. A wanderer with no family nearby who disappeared into the city's periphery might disappear from memory as thoroughly as from the earth. Amaral was himself one of these invisible people. He understood, perhaps instinctively rather than strategically, the protection that anonymity offers. He had been anonymous his entire life, invisible to institutions, unregistered, drifting. He existed in the city as a kind of negative space, present without being seen, moving without leaving a trace that anyone thought important enough to follow. Until the survivor, until that one young man whose fear overrode whatever hesitation might have kept him from walking into a police station and saying, "This happened to me, and I believe it was the same man who killed the others." The investigation sharpened. Officers began looking for a specific type of individual in specific kinds of locations: the outer districts, the airfield vicinity, the places where the city's edges blurred into emptiness. They were looking for an older man, African-Brazilian, weathered by decades of labor and wandering, someone who made his approach to young men with an apparent air of ordinariness. What they were looking for was, it turned out, already somewhere in the city, possibly watching the very investigation that was searching for him, as invisible as he had always been, still surviving on the odd job, still moving through Sao Paulo's edges the way he always had. The city did not know how close it was. And in the weeks before the arrest, while Sao Paulo's newspapers continued to print terror in daily installments, while families warned their young men, while the police continued their methodical search, at least one more death may have occurred. The exact timeline of crimes is not fully established. What is established is that by the time José Augusto do Amaral came within law enforcement's reach, the atmosphere in the city had reached the kind of pitch that precedes mob justice. The people of Sao Paulo were not waiting for a trial. They were waiting for a name, and when they got one, what followed was an eruption that revealed how far collective fear, once fully inflamed, could push a city beyond the boundaries of its own laws. There is no precise date attached to the moment of his capture in the way that dramatic arrests are sometimes recorded. No specific account of officers closing in, no description of the exact location where José Augusto do Amaral was finally taken into custody. What the historical record does preserve is the outcome. By 1927, he was in the hands of Sao Paulo law enforcement, and the city knew it almost immediately. The news broke with the velocity of something the city had been physically straining toward. For months, Sao Paulo had been consuming a diet of fear. The newspaper accounts, the warnings passed between neighbors, the collective understanding that something was out there in the outer dark of the city doing things that decent people did not discuss in full in daylight. The arrest was, in that sense, a release valve, a name, a face, an end to the uncertainty that had kept the city in a sustained state of dread. But the name the newspapers printed, and the face that appeared in the limited photography of the era, were attached to something that immediately complicated the city's desire for clean resolution. José Augusto do Amaral was 55 years old. He was an old man by the standards of the era, a former soldier, a former slave son, a drifter who had spent decades surviving at the margins of a society that had never made space for him. He was not physically imposing in the way the newspaper's construction of a monster might have suggested. He was weathered. He was ordinary-looking. He was, in almost every external register, utterly unremarkable. This is the most disturbing thing about what the arrest revealed. There had been nothing to see. Whatever lived inside José Augusto do Amaral, whatever compulsion the forensic psychiatrist who later examined him attempted to categorize and explain, it did not announce itself on his surface. He had walked through Sao Paulo streets, approached its young men, conducted himself with sufficient normality to make initial contact, and nothing about his exterior had triggered the alarm that should have preceded a monster. Inside the precinct, the investigation immediately turned brutal in a direction that would shadow the entire case for the next century. Amaral was tortured. This is not a claim made from sentimentality or a desire to rehabilitate a potentially guilty man. It is a documented feature of the case, one that the historical record acknowledges and that fundamentally destabilizes everything that follows. The Sao Paulo police of 1927 operated in an era of investigation that did not recognize torture as a disqualifying practice. Coerced confessions were routine. The infliction of physical suffering on a suspect was considered, in practice if not in law, a legitimate tool for extracting the truth. The assumption embedded in this approach, that pain reliably produces accurate information, is, of course, catastrophically flawed. People under torture will say what they believe their torturers want to hear. They will construct confessions that match the shape of the accusation because the alternative is continued agony. Amaral confessed. He confessed to the murders. He provided details. He described, in whatever form his tortured statements took, the acts that had been attributed to him, the approaches, the violence, the locations, the victims. The confession was exactly what the investigation and the panicking city needed. A complete, first-person account that closed the gap between suspicion and certainty. Except that it wasn't certainty. It was a confession extracted from a man who had already been subjected to whatever physical pressures the officers applied, delivered in a context where continuing to deny would simply mean continuing to suffer. The confession told the police and the newspapers and the enraged city what they already believed. It confirmed the shape of the monster they had already constructed. It was, in every way that matters legally and morally, profoundly unreliable. But reliability was not what 1927 São Paulo was interested in. It was interested in confirmation. The psychiatrist who examined Amaral during his imprisonment produced assessments that tell us as much about the era's medical prejudices as they do about their subject. The doctor documented Amaral's statements about his own body, his own history, including claims that Amaral made about himself which the psychiatrist then interpreted through the warped lens of contemporary racial pseudoscience. The examinations, published later in a forensic psychiatry compendium that circulated in Brazilian medical and legal circles, drew connections between Amaral's blackness, his purported anatomy, and his alleged crimes in ways that were nakedly racist and scientifically worthless. The language of that era's forensic psychiatry classified certain men, specifically black men, as inherently degenerate, inherently inclined toward what it termed sexual disorder, inherently positioned closer to animality than to the humanity its authors implicitly reserved for whiteness. Amaral was, in those documents, not just a criminal. He was a category, a proof point for a theory that his examiners had already committed to before he entered the room. The examination was not an attempt to understand a specific individual. It was an attempt to locate a specific individual within a pre-existing framework that had been built to dehumanize people who looked like him. This is the layer beneath the surface horror of the crimes themselves, the institutional horror of what happened to Amaral after his arrest. A man who was tortured into confession, then examined by doctors who had already decided what his body meant and what his mind contained, then held in a cell while a furious city called for his death. The newspapers had christened him O Monstro Negro, the Black Monster, and O Diabo Negro, the Black Devil. Both names carried the full weight of the racial terror they were designed to evoke. The black body as monstrous, the black man as diabolical. The language was not incidental. It was structural. It reflected the deep vein of racism running through Brazilian society in 1927, a society that had abolished slavery fewer than 40 years earlier and had done nothing meaningful in the interim to dismantle the hierarchies that slavery had built. Amaral's alleged crimes were real in the sense that young men had genuinely been killed and their bodies found. Whatever happened to those young men was genuinely horrific. But the machinery that processed Amaral, the torture, the racist psychiatric examination, the newspaper nicknames that reduced him to a racial archetype of danger, was its own kind of horror operating in plain sight, sanctioned by the state and amplified by the press. Meanwhile, outside the precinct walls, the city's rage was reaching a temperature that no institutional response could fully contain. The population of São Paulo, inflamed by months of front-page terror and now given a name and a face to attach their fear to, wanted Amaral dead. Not convicted, not tried, dead. The language used in public discourse about his fate drew on the very vocabulary of mob justice. Lynching, which had its own terrible history in Brazil, was openly discussed as the appropriate response to what he had allegedly done. Police held the crowd back. Barely. The precinct where Amaral was held became a focal point for gathered anger, people congregating outside with the specific energy of a mob that has a target and is waiting only for the opportunity to act on it. And then something happened that the city's rage had not accounted for. The murders did not stop. While Jose Augusto do Amaral sat in a cell, tortured, confessed, named in every newspaper, discussed on every street corner, similar crimes were reported. Young men found in conditions that echoed the earlier victims. The pattern that the entire investigation had attributed to Amaral, the pattern for which he was being held, was apparently continuing. Either Amaral had an accomplice, or Amaral had been conducting crimes from within his cell in some impossible fashion. Or, and this is the possibility that would refuse to be buried, the wrong man was sitting in that cell. The city, which had oriented its fear so completely toward the figure of Preto Amaral that it had no psychological room left for uncertainty, did not process this development cleanly. The newspapers, which had built their coverage on the architecture of a solved case, did not pivot gracefully. The continuing crimes were reported, questioned, contextualized in ways that preserved the essential narrative the city had already committed to. But the doubt was there. Small, stubborn, impossible to fully silence. And Amaral, who would never speak to it in any context that might be considered reliable, was running out of time. The tuberculosis that had been consuming him long before his arrest was advancing inside the cell. The disease that had been a quiet companion through his years of wandering, a common killer in 1920s Brazil, particularly among the poor and homeless, was now moving faster than justice. The trial that São Paulo had been anticipating, the legal reckoning that even a guilty verdict in absentia might have provided, was slipping out of reach. Not because of any legal maneuver or technicality, because the man in the cell was dying. Jose Augusto do Amaral died on July 12, 1927. He died in São Paulo, in the city he had allegedly terrorized, in the custody of the state that had tortured his confession out of him of tuberculosis. A disease of the lungs that does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, that takes hold in bodies weakened by poverty and overcrowding and years of inadequate nutrition, that was quietly claiming lives across Brazil's poorest communities every single day while the newspapers devoted their front pages to serial killers and monsters. He died without trial, without conviction, without a verdict of any kind. He died, legally speaking, innocent. Not because anyone formally proclaimed his innocence, but because the system that had arrested and held him never completed the process that might have established his guilt in any manner recognized by law. He was simply gone. The case file existed. The confession existed. The bodies of the victims existed. But the man at the center of it all had slipped the surly bonds of earthly accountability in the most final and anticlimactic way possible. The city of São Paulo received the news of his death with a complicated mixture of emotions that do not reduce neatly to any single response. There was certainly a kind of grim relief. The man they had called a monster was gone, was no longer a physical threat regardless of whatever legal process might have awaited him. There was also, unmistakably, frustration. The trial that had been promised, the public reckoning, the moment at which the city could look directly at the horror it had survived and see it formally condemned, that would never come. There was no closing ceremony, no verdict to be printed, no sentence that functioned as a container for the experience. The mob that had called for his lynching never got its violence. The courts never got their case. São Paulo got a death certificate and a silence where the answer should have been. But the story did not end there. It never does in cases like this one, cases where the question of guilt remains genuinely unresolved, where the machinery that processed a suspect was so contaminated by racial prejudice and coercive interrogation that its conclusions cannot be trusted, where the evidence points in multiple directions and the man who might have clarified everything is no longer available to be asked. The continuing crimes. Those reports of similar attacks that had surfaced while Amaral sat imprisoned were never fully explained. If Amaral had been the sole perpetrator, then his arrest should have ended the pattern. The reports of post-arrest crimes suggest either that investigators were wrong about attribution, or that São Paulo in 1926 and 1927 harbored more than one individual engaged in this type of violence, or that the pattern being attributed to Amaral was never as tightly linked to a single person as the investigation assumed. These are not comfortable possibilities. They are, however, honest ones, and they are the possibilities that would eventually force a different kind of reckoning. Not in a courtroom, but in an academic one, nearly a century after the original events. In the decades following Amaril's death, his story settled into Brazilian cultural memory in a peculiar way. He was, as an archetype, useful. His case was cited in forensic psychiatry texts as an early example of a specific criminal profile. His name appeared in histories of São Paulo crime. He was the first, the origin point, the before that gave Brazilian true crime its earliest chapter. But the framing was almost always that of certainty. He had done it. He was the monster. The Black Devil of São Paulo had preyed on young men, been caught, confessed, and died. The narrative was complete, even if the legal process was not. For decades, the story was told this way, in true crime literature and oral history alike, because complete narratives are more comfortable than unresolved ones. Then the researchers arrived. Academic examination of the Preto Amaral case, including serious historical and forensic analysis that emerged in the 21st century, began pulling at threads that the original investigation and the subsequent cultural memory had either glossed over or deliberately ignored. The researchers found the torture documented in records. They found the racial psychiatric frameworks that had been applied to Amaril's examination and found them scientifically indefensible. They found the reports of crimes during his imprisonment. They found the pattern of assumptions that had driven the investigation, assumptions about black male sexuality, black male criminality, that were rooted not in evidence but in the deep racist architecture of Brazilian society at the time. What they produced was not an exoneration, not a declaration that Amaral was innocent. What they produced was something more intellectually honest and more disturbing in its own way. The demonstration that the case against José Augusto do Amaral was built on a foundation that cannot be trusted. The confession coerced through torture is not reliable evidence. The psychiatric assessments, conducted through the lens of racial pseudoscience, are not credible clinical documents. The investigation, driven by public hysteria, newspaper-generated panic, and the specific cultural assumption that a black man of Amaral's age and background must be the source of the city's terror, produced a conclusion that satisfied the city's emotional needs without necessarily establishing the historical or legal truth. In 2012, 85 years after Amaral's death, a remarkable event occurred at the law school of the University of São Paulo, a simulated jury, a formal mock trial using available evidence, conducted by legal scholars and students in the institution's Noble Hall, convened to examine the case that had never been examined in an actual courtroom. The evidence was presented. Arguments were made on both sides. The assembled participants deliberated. The result: José Augusto do Amaral was acquitted by 257 votes to 57. Posthumously, symbolically, in a proceeding that carried no legal weight but carried enormous moral and intellectual weight. The majority of the mock jury, examining the evidence as it existed and as it had been critically analyzed, concluded that it was insufficient to sustain a conviction. This does not tell us that Amaral was innocent. It tells us that we cannot know. And the "we cannot know" is itself the most haunting part of this story. Because if Amaral did not kill those 3 young men whose bodies were found near Campo de Marte and the city's outskirts, then whoever did was never identified, never prosecuted, never stopped through any formal mechanism. The real killer in that scenario simply walked away. The city's panic, its arrest, its torture of a drifter who fit the profile its assumptions had constructed, gave the actual perpetrator exactly the cover needed to disappear into history. 3 young men were still dead regardless. Their deaths were real. Their suffering was real. The violence done to their bodies was real and documented and brutal. Whatever happened to them demanded justice. What they received instead was a city's terror projected onto the nearest available vessel. A man who was tortured into saying yes, followed by a death that precluded any further examination. Today, the story of José Augusto do Amaral occupies a strange dual space in Brazilian memory. He sits in São Paulo's crime museum as the first serial killer, an origin point, a historical artifact, a chapter-opening figure in a dark catalog that would grow considerably longer in the century that followed. His story was dramatized in a theatrical production titled The Crimes of Preto Amaral, which ran in São Paulo and engaged audiences with the atmospheric horror of the case. His name appears in Ilana Casois's influential book on Brazilian serial killers, which brought these cases to popular attention. He is remembered as a monster. He may have been one. But the machinery that decided he was a monster, the torture, the racist science, the newspaper nicknames, the public hysteria, was also monstrous. It is possible to hold both of these truths simultaneously. It is, in fact, necessary to hold both of them simultaneously if we are going to look at this case with clear eyes. The victims deserve our clarity. They were young men who went somewhere with someone and did not come back. They were found in ways that their families and the city that knew them could not easily process. They were killed by someone who strangled them with hands and intention and then violated them further, someone who chose isolated locations and understood how to make young men trust an approach before the approach became fatal. That someone existed. The violence was real. Whether the man who died in a São Paulo cell on July 12, 1927, was that someone, that question the city of São Paulo never actually answered. It answered a different question, a simpler one, a question it had partly constructed for itself. And it accepted that answer because the alternative was to sit with the unbearable possibility that the real answer was still out there somewhere, still unknown, never to be recovered. São Paulo grew. It expanded outward from the neighborhoods where Amaral had walked, from the scrubland near Campo de Marte where the first body was found, from the precinct walls where a dying man confessed to things that may or may not have been true. The city grew enormous and loud and complicated, and it carried this story with it like a stone in the pocket of its history. Small enough to ignore most of the time, heavy enough to feel when attention turned toward it. Brazil's criminal history would go on to produce many more names, many more cases that would fill the chapters following Amaral's in the dark catalog. Serial killers who were tried, convicted, sentenced. Cases where the evidence was clear and the guilt was established beyond reasonable dispute. Cases where the names of the guilty were matched with confidence to the evidence of their crimes. But none of them is first. None of them occupies the origin point. That belongs to Preto Amaral. Or rather, to the unresolved, uncomfortable, permanently open question that Preto Amaral represents. The first chapter in Brazilian serial killer history is not a clean chapter. It does not end with a gavel coming down and justice being formally done. It ends with a man dying in a cell, the city's rage cooling slowly into something that looked like resolution but was actually just exhaustion, and 3 young men who were never fully avenged because the process that was supposed to avenge them was too broken, too biased, too tortured in every sense of that word to produce anything it could honestly call the truth. The ground near Campo de Marte is occupied now. Built over, absorbed into the expanding city, trafficked by modern São Paulo's relentless daily movement. Whatever the earth there held has long since been covered. The bodies were recovered. The investigation was closed by death rather than verdict. The newspapers moved on to other terrors. But the question remained. It remains now, quiet, patient, permanent. Who killed those young men in São Paulo between 1926 and 1927? Was it the man the city named? Or did the real answer die unasked, unexamined, unchallenged? Because São Paulo needed a monster so badly that it made one out of whatever was available, and what was available was a tired, sick, invisible old man who had spent his entire life being exactly the kind of person that history is most comfortable sacrificing. We cannot know. And in that not knowing, somewhere between the body found near the airfield and the death certificate filed in July 1927, 3 young men and 1 accused old man are still waiting for the truth, for justice, for the clarity that 1920s São Paulo did not have the tools or the will to provide. This is the case of José Augusto do Amaral Preto Amaral, the Black Devil of São Paulo, Brazil's first serial killer, or Brazil's first wrongly accused man, or both, or something far more complicated than either of those clean labels allows. The file is open, the verdict never came, and the ground near Campo de Marte has been keeping its secrets for nearly 100 years. Rest in peace to the victims, and may the truth, wherever it resides, be patient enough to outlast the lies told in its name. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Shadow Between the Smokestacks. AKA Omaniaco do Industrial, the industrial maniac of Contagem. He had a wife, 5 children, and a Bible in his cell, and 5 dead women in his wake. Somewhere between the roar of factory machines and the silence of an empty road, a man with 5 children at home and a Bible on his nightstand was deciding which woman would not make it home tonight. He was not the kind of evil that announces itself. He did not wear the face of a monster. He wore the face of a neighbor, quiet, unremarkable, someone you might pass in a narrow corridor and think nothing of. He had a wife. He attended to his children. He once scrawled the name of Jesus on the walls of a factory where he briefly worked. And yet, between April of 2009 and February of 2010, across 315 blood-soaked days, the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte, Brazil, was stalked by a predator so calculated, so methodical, so utterly cold that detectives who later studied his pattern said they had never encountered anything like it. He chose his victims based on appearance. Dark-haired, attractive, alone. He waited, he moved, he strangled, he violated, and then he took their phones not as trophies of sentiment, but as commodities, as if the lives he had just extinguished were simply transactions to be balanced. His name was Marcos Antunes Trigueiro. The streets called him something else. They called him Omaniaco do Industrial, the industrial maniac. And by the time the city understood the depth of what he was, 5 women, 5 mothers were already gone. To understand what Marcos Antunes Trigueiro became, you must first understand what he appeared to be, because in the landscape of true crime, the most dangerous predators are never the ones who look dangerous. They are the ones who look like everyone else. They are the ones who smile at you across a fence, who wave at you from a car window, who sit beside you in a waiting room without ever raising the hair on the back of your neck. Trigueiro was that man. In the most terrifying and complete sense of the phrase, he was that man. He was born on the 29th of May, 1978, in Brasilia de Minas, a modest town nestled in the northern reaches of the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. Minas Gerais, whose name translates literally to General Mines, is a vast, sprawling state shaped by centuries of mineral extraction, colonial architecture, and the kind of hard, working-class pride that runs in the blood of its people like iron or through its earth. Belo Horizonte, its capital, is the 3rd largest city in Brazil, a dense, layered urban landscape of hills and highways, favelas and factories, churches and commerce. It is a city of contradictions, radiant on its better days, grinding and indifferent on its worst. It was into the orbit of this city that Marcos Trigueiro would eventually settle, and it was in its industrial corridors that he would carve out a territory of terror that would paralyze an entire metropolitan region. His early years were unremarkable to those who knew him from the outside. He moved around, spending time in Sao Paulo, drifting through Rio de Janeiro, but always returned to Minas Gerais, as if the state had a gravitational pull over him he could never fully escape. He carried no obvious signs of the violence fermenting inside him, at least none that were visible to casual observers. Neighbors who would later be interviewed described him as quiet, contained, a man who did not engage with those around him. He did not cause scenes. He did not draw attention. He existed at the edges of social spaces, observing, absorbing, cataloging. He was married not once, but at least twice over the course of his life, and he fathered 5 children. 5. The weight of that number would later sit heavily on those who worked his case, because it revealed the stunning normalcy of the domestic structure he inhabited even as he committed acts of staggering brutality. He was not some isolated, friendless ghoul living in a rotting house at the end of a forgotten road. He was a husband, A father. A man with mouths to feed and a household to manage. He worked, or tried to. He spent time as a driver, navigating the roads of the metropolitan region with a familiarity that would later prove critically relevant to understanding how he selected and targeted his victims. He also briefly worked in a factory near his home in the Barrow Industrial District of Contagem, the working-class municipality that borders Belo Horizonte to the west. It was at this factory that one of the only glimpses of something unsettling surfaced publicly before the killings began. He was reprimanded by management for writing the word Jesus on the factory walls. Not threatening language, not violent imagery, just a name scrawled in a place it did not belong. It was odd, it was noted, and it was forgotten. What was not forgotten, though perhaps not sufficiently acted upon, was his criminal history. The files on Marcos Antunes Trigueiro at the 4th District of Bedtime, another municipality in the greater Belo Horizonte area, were not thin. He had been arrested before. He had a record of armed robbery, including the holdup of a taxi driver. In December of 2004, he had walked into a pizzeria and churrascaria in Contagem, robbed the establishment at gunpoint, and made off with cash, mobile phones, personal documents, bank cards, and checkbooks from customers who had simply been trying to enjoy a meal. That robbery would eventually catch up with him years later, adding decades to his total sentence. But in the years between that crime and the eruption of the killings, Trigueiro seemed to move through the legal net. He remained free. He remained among the public. He remained close to women who did not know they were walking near something capable of destroying them. Forensic psychiatrists who later evaluated him did not classify him as clinically insane. This is a distinction that matters enormously in these cases, because it strips away any comfortable narrative about madness being the engine of the violence. He was not delusional. He was not hearing voices that commanded him to kill. He was not disconnected from reality in the way that might, in some people's minds, make the horror slightly more digestible. What he presented, according to those medical evaluations, was a profound and deeply embedded personality disorder. The architecture of a mind that processed other human beings not as full, autonomous, feeling people, but as objects to be used and discarded according to his own internal calculus. He was, in the clinical language used to describe such individuals, a man of extreme and organized predatory instinct operating behind a mask of complete and deliberate normalcy. And the city of Contagem, with its dense clusters of residential neighborhoods, its patchwork of industrial zones, its web of semi-anonymous streets where people moved through their daily lives without expecting catastrophe, was the perfect hunting ground for what he intended to do. The year 2009 arrived the way most years do in a city like Belo Horizonte, with the hum of commerce resuming after the holiday season, with traffic building again on the major arteries, with the rhythm of ordinary life reasserting itself. Nobody in Contagem or its surrounding municipalities woke up that January anticipating a predator. Nobody looked at the streets differently. Nobody changed their habits. Women went about their lives, shopping, working, parenting, commuting, the way they always had, in the way all of us do when we do not yet know that something has changed, that something terrible has entered the space we move through. The first death came in January of 2009. Her name was Adina Fighter Porto. She was 34 years old. The details of exactly how she came into contact with her killer, the precise mechanics of the encounter, belong to the clinical record, but the result was absolute. She was strangled. Her life was terminated by hands that pressed without hesitation, without mercy, without any of the instinct toward restraint that separates acts of violence from acts of murder. After she was dead, Marcos Trigueiro took her mobile phone. That detail, so practical, so transactional, would ultimately become one of the threads that unraveled him. But not yet. Not for a long time yet. What followed the death of Adina Fighter Porto was something that investigators who would later reconstruct the timeline described with barely concealed disbelief. Not at the audacity of the killer, though his audacity was considerable, but at how completely the crime initially disappeared into the noise of a large metropolitan area. Women go missing. Bodies are discovered. In a region of millions of people, individual tragedies can absorb into the data without immediately producing the recognition that they are connected, that they are not random, that they form a pattern. Detectives were not yet connecting the dots because in January of 2009, there was only one dot. But Marcos Triguero was already selecting the next one. He had a type, and this is not an abstraction, not a vague characterization, but a specific and documented preference that investigators later confirmed with precision. He targeted women who were dark-haired, physically attractive, and alone. Women who were in motion, moving through the city independently, without the protection of accompaniment. Women who existed in the geography of his hunting ground within reach. He watched them the way a man with patience and no conscience watches. Coolly, analytically, without the emotional interference that constrains most people. He assessed risk. He identified vulnerability. And then he moved. He used his familiarity with the roads of the region, that familiarity built through years of driving professionally, of navigating Contagem and Belo Horizonte at all hours, to select locations that were useful to him. The industrial district that bears the name of his most notorious alias was not just a neighborhood. It was a geography of advantage, a zone of long, semi-deserted stretches, of spaces between streetlights, of the kind of urban topography that predators throughout history have recognized and exploited. He was not operating randomly. He was operating within a calculated radius, a polygon of death centered around the Barrero region and the industrial belt, a zone he knew the way a person knows the interior of their own home. And he did something else that distinguished him from disorganized killers. He cleaned up after himself. He did not leave obvious trails. He disposed of evidence. He moved the bodies or left them in locations that delayed their discovery. He took the phones, not because he had a sentimental attachment to the objects, but because a phone could be traced, a phone could ping towers, a phone could tell a story he did not want told. He was already thinking about the investigation before the investigation had even begun. That level of post-defense calculation is the signature of a predator operating with cold, deliberate intelligence. Someone who understood, at least intuitively, how forensic investigations were conducted and was actively working to disrupt them. The months of early 2009 passed. The city breathed and moved and did not yet know what was moving among it. And then, in April, everything accelerated. April 17, 2009. The date is fixed in the criminal record of Minas Gerais with the kind of permanence that attaches to the worst days. The days when ordinary life and unthinkable horror intersect in a moment so specific that every detail around it becomes crystallized in memory. It was a Thursday. The streets of Belo Horizonte's Noroeste region were doing what streets in busy Brazilian cities always do. Breathing with traffic, with commerce, with the uncountable small transactions of human life moving through the day. Ana Carolina Meneses Assuncel was 27 years old. She was a businesswoman, a commerciant, in the Brazilian term that carries the weight of someone who has built something, who contributes to the economy of her community through her own labor and initiative. She was a mother. Her child, a boy of 1 year and 6 months, was with her on that day. She had her whole life arranged around her in the way that young mothers with businesses and futures arrange their lives, with purpose, with forward motion, with the reasonable expectation that the next hour would resemble the last. She never reached wherever she was going. The account of what happened next belongs to the evidence. To the car that was found in the João Pinheiro neighborhood with her belongings arranged inside it, to the absence of her phone, which Triguero took, and to the discovery of her body, strangled in the industrial district. She had been abducted. She had been violated. And she had been killed with a ferocity that investigators who processed the scene would carry with them for years. The child she had been driving with was left behind. A detail so devastating in its implications, in the image it conjures of a small person waiting in confusion for a mother who would never return, that it became one of the defining points of horror in the broader public accounting of these crimes. The city noticed, but the city had not yet understood. The death of Ana Carolina Meneses Assuncel was investigated. Detectives worked the case. Her car had been found in the industrial district of Contagem the day before her body was located. All of her belongings present except the mobile phone. That absence was recorded. That detail sat in a file. And Marcos Triguero, who had taken the phone, who was at that moment presumably in possession of it, perhaps using it, perhaps already in the process of selling it, moved back into the city and waited. Summer moved through Minas Gerais in the way Brazilian summers do. Heavily, with heat that settles on the skin and does not lift until well into the evening. The city breathed differently in the heat. People moved more slowly, more carefully. And yet the ordinary rhythms of life continued, because life always continues until it doesn't, because most people who are alive believe they will remain alive and arrange their behavior accordingly. Months passed. Then September arrived, and with it, the third murder. Maria Helena Lopez Aguiar was 48 years old. An age that speaks to decades of life built carefully, of children grown or growing, of a relationship to the world shaped by experience. She was alone when he found her. She was selected the way all his victims were selected, by a predator who had refined his method, who was operating within the same geographical frame, who struck and then withdrew back into the ordinary texture of Contagem as if nothing had occurred. The pattern was the same: the strangulation, the assault, the taken phone. The body moved, concealed, discovered later in a condition that told forensic examiners everything they needed to know about the violence and nothing at all, yet about who had authored it. And then October, and then November. The killings were accelerating. Natalia Cristina de Almeida Paiva was 27 years old when she was murdered in October of 2009. Young, her whole adult life still forming around her. She was, like the others, dark-haired and alone when the encounter occurred, and she was strangled, that same deliberate, physical act of extinguishing another person's breath, and violated, and her phone was removed from her possession as though the phone were the point, as though she were merely incidental to its acquisition. Edna Cordero de Oliveira Freitas came next. She was 35 years old. She was killed on the 11th of November, 2009. Her phone was the one that Trigueiro would later, in his post-arrest confession, provide specific information about. He told investigators that he had sold it to a third party, a person not yet identified. The casualness of that detail, the transaction, the offloading of a murder victim's personal device into the second-hand economy as if it were a used appliance, is, in its own quiet way, one of the most chilling elements of the entire case. It speaks to a complete and total disengagement from the humanity of the people he killed. They were not people to him in those moments. They were obstacles that became acquisitions. 5 women were now dead. The murder spanned from January to November of 2009, and then there was a pause. A terrible, ambiguous silence over the final weeks of the year and into the new one. A silence that investigators would later understand as the calm of a predator who had not stopped wanting to kill but was perhaps growing more careful, more attuned to the fact that the city was beginning to look. Because by early 2010, the city was beginning to look. The detectives working out of the civil police of Minas Gerais. A body that would, in the aftermath of this case, emerge with significant credit for the methodological precision with which it ultimately pursued and cornered its quarry, had begun to recognize something in the accumulating evidence that changed the nature of their work. On February 2, 2010, police officially disclosed what their forensic analysis had been building toward for months. The murders shared a common behavioral signature, and DNA evidence confirmed that biological material recovered from 3 of the 2009 victims belonged to a single perpetrator. One man, one predator, moving through a defined geographical territory, targeting a specific type of woman, killing in a specific manner, taking a specific category of item from each victim. This was not a series of unconnected crimes. This was a campaign. The announcement transformed the investigation from a collection of individual homicide cases into a coordinated manhunt, and the pressure that came with that transformation was enormous. The public was now aware that a serial killer was operating in their metropolitan area. Women in Contagem and the surrounding municipalities altered their behavior. People who lived near the industrial district began to look differently at their neighbors, at the men they passed in the street. The atmosphere of the region, already shaped by the ordinary anxieties of life in a large, economically stratified Brazilian city, became freighted with a specific and targeted dread. Something else was happening simultaneously in the investigation, something that would prove decisive. The detectives working the case had begun to notice a detail so fundamental to the killer's method that its significance, once recognized, was almost stunning in its clarity. He always took the phones. Every single victim, every one of the 5 confirmed dead women had her mobile phone removed from her possession after her death. In a case where so much had been obscured, concealed, or destroyed, the phones were an absence that spoke volumes. And phones, unlike bodies, move. Phones emit signals. Phones connect to cell towers and leave electronic footprints in the infrastructure of telecommunications networks. The phones were not just trophies or commodities. They were, without Triguero knowing it, a rope tied around his own neck. The decision was made to track them. There is a particular kind of investigative intelligence that distinguishes the cases that get solved from the cases that don't. And it is not always the most sophisticated forensic technology, not always the largest team, not always the most resources. Sometimes it is something simpler and harder to manufacture. The willingness to sit with the available evidence long enough to hear what it is actually saying, rather than what investigators want or expect it to say. In the case of Marcos Antunes Triguero, that process, that patient, exhausting, pressure-saturated process of listening to what the evidence was saying, eventually produced an answer. But the road to that answer was built from a series of meetings, reconstructions, and analytical breakthroughs that happened in the worst possible context. With the bodies still accumulating, with the city in a state of mounting panic, and with the certainty that if they did not move quickly enough, there would be more women in the ground before the year was out. The coordinating officer on the case, Delegate Edson Morera, one of the primary figures in the investigation, later described the organizational shift that preceded the eventual capture. It was, in essence, a consolidation of intelligence across a metropolitan area that had previously been processing these deaths in something close to isolation. The Greater Belo Horizonte region encompasses multiple municipalities, multiple police districts, multiple command structures. Cases can slip through the gaps between jurisdictions the way water slips through the cracks in old infrastructure. Not through negligence necessarily, but through the sheer structural complexity of policing a sprawling urban region. The meetings that Morera's team convened brought together commanders from across the metropolitan area and forced a shared examination of the accumulated data. And what emerged from that shared examination was a profile of the victims that, when laid out collectively rather than examined individually, carried an unmistakable coherence. The women were morenas, dark-complexioned, dark-haired. They were uniformly physically attractive. They were alone at the time of the encounter. And they were all found within a relatively confined geographic zone, the polygon around the Barrero region and the industrial belt of Contagem, a district that, once you understood the killer's relationship to it, stopped looking like a coincidence and started looking like a choice, like an address. This geographic consistency was, in retrospect, one of the most significant indicators available to investigators. Serial killers who operate within a defined comfort zone, within what criminologists call an anchor point radius, the territory closest to where they live, work, or spend their most familiar time, tend to be embedded in that territory in ways that leave records. Driver's license addresses, employment histories, utility accounts, cell tower registrations. The geography itself becomes a kind of filter, narrowing the universe of possible perpetrators to those who could be placed with documented regularity within that zone. And this is where the phones became critical. The technical process of tracking mobile devices was, by 2010, already a reasonably established investigative tool in Brazil, though its application in serial murder cases was still relatively novel in the Minas Gerais context. The decision to pursue the cell phones, to use their signals as a navigational instrument to follow backward from the dead women's last locations toward whoever now held the devices, was made with the awareness that it was likely the strongest active thread in the investigation. There were no eyewitnesses who had come forward with a useful description. There was DNA, but DNA without a match in the database is a confirmation of facts already known, not a road to a suspect. The phones were the road. Edna Cordero's phone, as Triguero would later admit in his confession, had been sold to an unknown third party. But there were other phones, other signals. The technological net cast by investigators began to pull in data, cell tower pings, registrations, geolocation patterns that could be cross-referenced against the movements of known individuals in the database of persons of interest. At some point during this process, at some point in the weeks between the official announcement of the serial killer's existence in February 2010 and the arrest later that month, a name began to rise above the noise. A name attached to a prior criminal record. A name connected to the industrial district of Contagem. A name that, when investigators began pulling the available threads attached to it, did not stop unraveling. Marcos Antunes Triguero. He was 31 years old at the time. He was living in a modest residence on Rua Ecuador, number 51, in the Barrow Industrial, the very neighborhood that had provided his most famous alias. He was unemployed at that point, the driving work and factory employment both behind him. He was living with his wife, Rose de Paula Camara, and was, by all external appearances, a man simply existing in the economic precarity that characterized many households in the working-class neighborhoods of Greater Contagem. The intelligence began to build. The cell tower data, the geographic pattern, the prior criminal record, which included not only the armed robbery convictions but the lingering, terrible suspicion that had never been formally prosecuted. The death of his own infant stepdaughter from his first marriage, a child of 3 months who had died of what the death certificate recorded as traumatic brain injury. Police had noted the suspicion at the time. Nothing had been proven. The case had not moved. And so Marcos Triguero had moved on, married again, had more children, lived in the shadow of that unresolved question while building the architecture of what he was. There was another element that surfaced in the intelligence-gathering phase, a detail involving a family member, a piece of information passed through the social networks of people who knew the family, people who had seen something or heard something or handled something that did not feel right. A card associated with one of the victim's accounts, or connected to the network of stolen items, had been observed in a context that linked back to Triguero's orbit. His sister, aged around 31 at the time, had apparently found something, a card of some description, and mentioned it to an acquaintance who passed the information to the civil police. That fragment, small in itself, slotted into the larger pattern that investigators were assembling. By the time the decision was made to move on the address at Rua Ecuador, the investigation had been running at full operational pressure for weeks. The announcement of the killer's existence had changed the dynamic in a way that investigators would later note with a degree of strategic significance. When the existence of the Maniaco do Industrial became public knowledge, when the city was told to be alert, when the faces and stories of the dead women were circulated through the media, the attacks stopped. He did not strike again after November 2009 and the publicity that surrounded the February 2010 announcements. Whether this was calculation, whether it was the particular sensitivity of a predator who understood that the city was now actively looking for him, or whether it was something else entirely, the cessation of attacks was documented and noted. He was not stupid. He understood exposure. He understood risk. But understanding risk and escaping it are different things. And by the morning of February 24, 2010, 20 officers, detectives, agents, and support personnel were converging on the address in the Barrow Industrial, armed with an arrest warrant issued by Judge Nelson Mishes. The arrest warrant was not issued on a whim. It was issued on the foundation of weeks of accumulated intelligence, forensic analysis, telecommunications data, cross-jurisdictional case review, and the slow, grinding work of investigators who had been under enormous pressure to produce a result before another body was found in the streets of their city. Judge Mishes's authorization represented the legal crystallization of all of that work, the point at which the evidence crossed the threshold from probability into juridical certainty. 20 officers entered the house at Rua Ecuador. They moved through it. They found Marcos Antunes Triguero hiding under his own bed. The industrial maniac, the man who had stalked and killed 5 women across 10 months, who had violated and strangled and disposed of human beings as though they were waste material, who had taken their phones and sold them and carried on with his life, was found curled beneath a mattress in a back room of a modest house on a street named after the equator. He was taken into custody, and within hours he began to talk. There is a moment in the interrogation room that investigators who work serial murder cases describe with a particular kind of complexity. The moment when a predator who has spent months or years maintaining silence, maintaining distance, maintaining the fiction of an ordinary life, finally opens his mouth and begins to confess. It is not a relief exactly. It is not resolution. The women are still dead. The grief of their families has not been diminished by the technical fact of a man in custody admitting to what he did. But there is something in the confession that matters, not for the living perhaps, but for the record, for the full accounting of what happened, for the names and the dates and the details that allow the victims to exist in history as something more than statistics. Marcos Antunes Triguero confessed on the night of his arrest. In a statement given to Delegate Frederico Abelha, one of the lead investigators, he did not hedge. He did not equivocate in the fundamental sense. He confirmed 5 names, 5 women, 5 deaths that he authored with his own hands in the span of 315 days. Adina Fighter Porto, 34 years old, murdered in January 2009. Ana Carolina Meneses Asuncel, 27 years old, murdered on April 17, 2009. A young businesswoman and mother whose child was with her when the encounter began. Maria Helena Lopez Aguiar, 48 years old, murdered in September 2009. Natalia Cristina de Almeida Paiva, 27 years old, murdered in October 2009. Edna Cordero de Oliveira Freitas, 35 years old, murdered on November 11, 2009. 5 women, 5 mothers, 5 lives terminated by strangulation in the industrial periphery of a city that had not known they were in danger until too late. In the same confession, Triguero provided specific information about the fate of some of the victims' mobile phones, the very items that had ultimately led investigators to his door. He confirmed that Edna Cordero's phone had been sold to a third party whose identity he provided limited details on. He spoke to investigators about the mechanics of his crimes with a directness that, according to those present, carried none of the emotional weight one might expect from a person accounting for 5 murders. He was practical. He was organized. He spoke the way someone speaks when they are settling accounts, not confessing sins, not seeking absolution, but simply confirming the transactions on a ledger. His wife, Rose de Paula Camara, was also mentioned in the immediate aftermath of the arrest. Triguero told police that Rose was aware of various prior criminal acts he had committed, but that she did not know the full extent of what he was, did not know that her husband was assaulting and killing women in the streets of the city they lived in. This detail, the degree of concealment he maintained even from the person who shared his home and his bed, underscores something that investigators and forensic psychologists who study predatory killers return to repeatedly: the architecture of the double life, the managed performance of the ordinary, the effort expended in maintaining the mask not out of remorse, but out of the pure strategic interest in remaining free to continue. Rose de Paula Camara was not charged. She had not been party to the murders. She had lived beside a man who was systematically destroying women in the city around her, and she had not known or had not known enough, and now she was left to process the catastrophic restructuring of her own reality in the glare of a case that would make national news. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest were extensive, multi-layered, and ultimately produced one of the most substantial sentences in Minas Gerais criminal history. The first major conviction came on June 30, 2010, barely 4 months after his arrest, when Triguero was sentenced to 34 years and 11 months for rape. This was the opening chapter of the judicial accounting. It would not be the last. A subsequent conviction delivered 98 years and 4 months in prison for the murders of Ana Carolina Meneses, Maria Helena Aguiar, and Edna Cordero Freitas, 3 of the 5 confirmed victims. The charges covered not only the killings themselves but concealment of bodies and the rapes that preceded and accompanied each death. The Brazilian legal system, which caps the amount of time any individual can actually serve regardless of the total sentence imposed, was navigating a case in which the symbolic and retributive dimensions of the sentencing were almost as significant as the practical ones. Then, in 2014, a further conviction was handed down. 29 years and 2 months for a separate crime that predated the serial killings entirely. The armed robbery of the pizzeria and churrascaria in Contagem on December 22, 2004, during which he had terrorized customers and stolen cash, phones, documents, and bank materials. The addition of this sentence brought his total to over 127 years of imprisonment at that point, a figure that continued to grow as the courts worked through the remaining charges. By the time the full judicial reckoning was completed, Marcos Antunes Triguero had been sentenced to 160 years in prison. 160 years, a number that carries its own kind of symbolic mathematics, as though the courts were attempting to give each of his victims decades of justice in exchange for the years he took from them. He was incarcerated in the Presidio Inspector José Martinho Drummond in Ribeiro das Neves, a prison in the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte, in a segregated wing. His placement in separation from the general population was, in part, a reflection of the nature of his crimes and the profile they had given him. Serial killers, with the public recognition of the industrial maniac, do not easily blend into the ordinary rhythms of prison life. And according to records available in the years following his incarceration, he had not been involved in further incidents of aggression while imprisoned. The same person who had scrawled Jesus on factory walls reportedly requested a Bible from his defense attorney in the days immediately following his arrest. The attorney brought it. What Marcos Antunes Trigueiro made of the pages inside it, what meaning, if any, he drew from the words of mercy and redemption printed on them, is not something the record illuminates. Delegate Edson Moreira, announcing the arrest on February 26, 2010, confirmed a detail that sharpened the horror of the case in a specific and important direction. At least 3 women had survived encounters with Trigueiro. 3 women had been targeted, approached, confronted, perhaps partially attacked, and had managed to escape. Their survival, their ability to break free from whatever circumstance he had created, meant that somewhere in the geography of those 315 days, 3 potential victims became witnesses. 3 women who knew the shape of the threat, who had looked at it or felt it and had gotten away. Those survivors were not publicly identified in detail. Their privacy was and remains appropriate. But their existence in the record carries significance beyond their individual survival, because it means the final count of 5 dead was not the number he intended. It means the 5 names on the list of the murdered represent, in a terrible and precise sense, the women he was able to hold long enough to kill. The ones who escaped did so through some combination of circumstance, resistance, and the particular fortune that is never evenly distributed and never earned but sometimes simply present. The announcement of his capture, the fact that the Maniaco do Industrial had been found beneath a bed in the Barrow Industrial, had been handcuffed and taken away in the early morning light, produced a reaction across Greater Belo Horizonte that those who lived through it described as complex. There was relief, certainly, the kind of relief that follows the end of a sustained collective fear, a releasing of breath that a city had been holding for months. But there was also grief, raw and unresolved, for the 5 women who had not lived to see the relief. There was anger at the timeline, at the length of time it had taken, at the months between the first death and the arrest during which the predator had continued to move freely among the public. There were questions about the prior criminal record, about the systems that had recorded his earlier offenses without preventing the escalation to murder. Those questions, though legitimate and important, were never fully answered in ways that satisfied the families of the dead. They rarely are. The spaces between what could have been done and what was done are one of the enduring sources of anguish in cases like this. The counterfactual grief that asks what would have happened if the dots had been connected sooner, if the file from the 4th District of Bedtime had been weighted more heavily, if the suspicion about the infant stepdaughter had been prosecuted, if any number of the small hinges in the sequence of events had turned differently. Marcos Antunes Trigueiro was, according to forensic psychiatry, not a man who was unaware of what he was doing. He was not a man in the grip of psychosis. He was a man who made choices, calculated, deliberate, repeated choices, to destroy human beings for reasons that ultimately resided in the landscape of his own disordered appetites. The personality disorder diagnosis neither excuses nor adequately explains the 5 murders. It describes the architecture of the mechanism. It does not account for the women themselves, for Ana Carolina, who had a son and a business and a future, for Adina, who was 34 and alive in January of 2009 and dead before the month was out, for Maria Helena, 48 years of living condensed into a file number and a forensic report, for Natalia and Edna, both 27 and 35, both mothers, both extinguished in the industrial periphery of a city that eventually came for the man who had done it. The Maniaco do Industrial is now in his mid-40s. He is behind concrete and steel in a segregated wing of a prison in Minas Gerais. His sentence exceeds any human lifespan. The mathematics of Brazilian sentencing law means he will not serve the full 160 years. The system caps actual time served at a fraction of the nominal total. But he will not leave. The mechanisms that contained him will hold. The city moved on, as cities always do, because cities cannot afford to stop moving, because the ordinary rhythms of life reassert themselves with a persistence that is both resilient and, at times, heartbreaking. The streets of Contagem still have their factories and their long stretches and their ordinary people moving through their days. The Barrow Industrial is still a neighborhood. Women still walk its streets, still move through the metropolitan geography of Greater Belo Horizonte, still live their lives without knowing. As most of us live ours without knowing what was once moving among them. But somewhere in the archive of the civil police of Minas Gerais, in the file cabinets of the courts of Belo Horizonte, in the memory of every detective and forensic examiner and delegate who worked this case, 5 names remain. Not case numbers, not victim profiles. Names: Adina, Anna Carolina, Maria Helena, Natalia, Edna. They were mothers. They were working women. They were alive. Fully, completely, irreversibly alive, before the man with the quiet face and the Bible request and the 5 children decided that they were something he could take. They were not something he could take. They were everything, and we remember them. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third and final story. Story 3. The Saint's Name, the Devil's Face. This is the story of O Maniaco do Parque, Francisco de Assis Pereira, a.k.a. the Motoboy Predator, the Smiling Strangler of Sao Paulo. He was named after a saint, wore the face of an opportunity, and carried death in his pocket like loose change. And by the time Sao Paulo understood what was hunting its daughters, 11 of them were already buried beneath the roots of the very park where families came to breathe. Picture this. You are young, perhaps 19, perhaps 22. The city hums around you. Motorcycles threading through traffic, vendors calling prices into the hot Sao Paulo air. Subway platforms thick with the ordinary chaos of survival. A man approaches you. He is not frightening. He is the opposite of frightening. He is warm-eyed, articulate, dressed with casual intention. He tells you that you have something photogenic, something the camera would love. He says there is a modeling agency, real work, real money. And all he needs is to take a few photographs, out in the open air, somewhere green and quiet. He hands you a business card that looks legitimate. He smiles the way people smile in churches. You have no reason to hesitate. You have every reason to say yes. And that single, entirely reasonable, entirely human moment of trusting a stranger is precisely how Francisco de Assis Pereira walked 11 women into the trees and walked back out alone. This is not a story about a monster hiding in shadows. This is a story about a monster who hid in plain sight, wearing the most dangerous disguise a predator can wear, the face of someone worth trusting. Welcome to the case that stopped Brazil cold, fractured a city's sense of safety, and left behind a body count that prosecutors would argue deserved not 30 years in prison, but 268. Sao Paulo does not sleep gently. It is a city of 20 million heartbeats, a place where the concrete never fully cools, where the air carries the permanent smell of exhaust and ambition and something older, something unnamed. In the late 1990s, it was a city in the thick of transformation. Economically volatile, socially divided, its southern neighborhoods a patchwork of working families, students, and the young and hungry who had come from the interior of Brazil looking for something better than what they had left behind. It was into this specific texture of city life, the subway stations crowded with commuters, the parks that offered rare patches of green relief, that Francisco de Assis Pereira was born, grew up, and eventually began to hunt. He entered the world on November 29, 1967, arriving with a name that was almost poetic in its cruelty given what he would become. His parents, Deeply religious people from Sao Paulo's interior christened him Francisco de Assis, after Francis of Assisi, the Italian saint celebrated for his gentleness, his love of all living creatures, his reputation as a man of peace. The irony of that name would not be lost on anyone who eventually read the court documents, who sat through the trial testimony, who heard the survivors describe what this man did when no one else was watching. He grew up in a household where religion was not decoration but structure. Mass, prayer, devotion, these were the rhythms of his childhood. But beneath the surface of that religious upbringing, something was fracturing. Pereira would later claim to investigators that as a child he was sexually abused by a family member. His aunt, he said, and that this abuse left him with a fixation, a dark preoccupation that he carried quietly for years while the world saw only a polite young man from a respectable family. He was charming from an early age. People who knew him in those years would later describe him using the same word repeatedly. Smooth. Francisco de Assis Pereira was smooth. He knew how to make people feel seen. He knew how to modulate his voice, how to lean forward with interest, how to listen with the particular attentiveness that makes someone feel special. These were not skills he learned consciously. They were simply part of what he was, a social instrument sharp enough to cut. As a young adult, he found work as a motorcycle courier, a motoboy, threading through Sao Paulo's impossible traffic at speed, delivering packages, running documents between offices, disappearing into the city's endless movement. It was the perfect occupation for a man who needed invisibility. A motoboy is everywhere and nowhere. He is background noise. He is part of the city's metabolism, unremarkable, unnoticed, a figure whose daily presence in any neighborhood requires no explanation. For Francisco, the motorcycle gave him mobility, access, and the perfect alibi of ordinariness. Nobody looked twice at a courier. Nobody asked where he was going. Nobody tracked his routes. He also roller skated. This detail would seem trivial if it were not precisely how he sometimes approached his victims. Gliding through the park with the relaxed confidence of someone who belonged there, a man at leisure, a man with nothing to hide. He skated through the Parque do Estado, the state park, a vast green lung on Sao Paulo's southern edge, a place with walking trails and open fields and dense patches of wooded interior where the city noise faded and the trees closed in, and he watched. He studied the park with the patient attention of someone mapping terrain for military purposes. He learned which paths led to seclusion. He learned which clearings were visible from the main walkways and which were not. He walked those wooded corridors until they were as familiar to him as the back of his own hand, until he could navigate them in low light, until he knew exactly how far from help a person would be once they followed him past a certain point. He was, in the truest sense of the word, preparing. But the park was only the ending. The beginning always happened somewhere else, somewhere bright and public and full of people. His primary hunting ground for victims was the subway system. Sao Paulo's metro was, in the late 1990s, one of the few places in the city where all economic classes genuinely mixed: students, office workers, domestic employees, young women from the periphery heading toward the center. Pereira haunted the platforms and the station exits. He watched for a particular type, not randomly, not indiscriminately, but with a targeting instinct that survivors would later describe with a shudder. He looked for women who appeared emotionally adrift. Women who seemed tired, worried, distracted. Women who carried the particular quietness of someone having a difficult day, or a difficult month, or a difficult life. Women who might be more susceptible than usual to the sudden attention of a man offering something that looked like hope. He had his script ready. The approach was always confident, never aggressive, never pressured. He presented himself as a talent scout. A representative of a modeling agency, he said, connected to photographers, connected to advertising clients, always on the lookout for fresh faces. He complimented the woman he was approaching with the precision of a craftsman. Not crude flattery, specific, credible flattery. He might note the shape of her cheekbones, the quality of her eyes, the way she carried herself. He would say that agencies were always looking for women with a natural quality, something that couldn't be manufactured, and that she had it. He would produce a card. He would mention names of legitimate-sounding agencies. He was persuasive with the authority of someone who genuinely knew the industry because he had studied it enough to speak its language convincingly. Then he would suggest the photographs. Just a few shots, he would say, in a natural setting. The park, the state park, was perfect for this kind of work, he would explain. Natural light, green backgrounds, no studio fees. Professional photographers used it all the time. Would she like to go now? Or set a time for the weekend? He made it sound routine. He made it sound like something that happened to other women every day, women who had said yes and found their faces on magazine pages. He was offering a door out of ordinary life, and he held it open with a smile that had been practiced to a shine. 11 women walked through that door. 11 women stepped off the subway platform, or paused at a mall entrance, or stood outside their workplace, and allowed this man to guide them toward a park. Some of them told family members where they were going. Some of them made a final phone call from the road, excited, saying they'd be home later, that they'd met someone interesting, that something good might be happening. Those last calls are among the most devastating details of this case. The sound of hope in a voice that had only hours left. What the women did not know, what they could not have known from anything they saw in those first moments of contact, was that Francisco de Assis Pereira had already done this before. Not just approached women, not just lured them, he had already killed. His escalation had begun before 1997 with assaults, with a sexual violence arrest in São José do Rio Preto in 1995 from which he walked free on bail, with crimes that the system absorbed and dismissed and failed to connect into a pattern. By the time he brought his first confirmed murder victim into the trees of Parque do Estado, he was not a man taking a new and terrible step. He was a man arriving at a destination he had been traveling toward for years. His first confirmed kill was Elisangela Francisco da Silva, 21 years old. She disappeared after he left her at a shopping mall following what she had understood to be a modeling appointment. Her body was recovered in the state park 3 days after her death. She had been raped and strangled with a rope. The investigators who processed the scene in 1997 had no reason yet to connect her death to anything larger. A young woman found dead in a park was, in the terrible statistics of Sao Paulo at that time, not yet a pattern. It was a tragedy and a crime and an open case. It was not yet the beginning of a series. That recognition would come far too late, at a cost measured in lives. Through 1997 and into 1998, Pereira continued. His method refined itself with repetition. He would lead a woman into the park under the cover of the modeling fiction, guide her deeper into the wooded sections where the trees thickened and the sounds of the city disappeared, and once they were sufficiently isolated, once there was no one within earshot, once the path behind them was empty, the mask would dissolve. What emerged in its place was something that survivors who escaped him described as a transformation so sudden and complete that it was almost disorienting. The warmth vanished. The smile died. The soft-spoken scout disappeared and something cold and purposeful took his place. And by the time that shift registered fully, the woman was already in a position from which escape required luck, strength, and the kind of desperate clarity that terror sometimes grants and sometimes destroys. He used shoelaces. This is one of the details that the case made infamous. Not a weapon brought from home, not a knife or a firearm, but something ordinary, something every person wears, something he could produce without alarm. He would use them as ligatures, wrapping them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that hesitation was gone. He strangled his victims after assaulting them. He bit them. There were wounds on the bodies that suggested not just violence but a desire to consume. To mark the flesh in ways that went beyond the mechanics of killing into something that investigators and forensic psychologists would later classify with terms borrowed from the darkest corners of criminal literature. He buried some of the bodies in the park. Others he left partially hidden beneath vegetation. One victim, Isadora Frankel, 19 years old, a student, he burned with gasoline 3 days after her death in what appeared to be a calculated effort at concealment. He led police to her remains after his arrest. A partially burned skeleton, covered with leaves, the gasoline still detectable in the soil around her. He said it without evident emotion. He said many things without evident emotion. That blankness, that calm, would disturb every professional who came into contact with him throughout the investigation and the trial. By the time the spring of 1998 arrived, 11 women were dead and 9 more had survived encounters with the same man. The survivors were the key. The survivors were the thread that would eventually unravel everything. But first, before the unraveling, before the manhunt, before the mob of 200 people who tried to tear him apart when police transferred him to prison, there were more deaths, more bodies buried in the soft earth beneath the trees of a park that thousands of ordinary São Paulo residents walked through every weekend without knowing what lay beneath their feet. The city was being hunted. Simply didn't know it yet. It is a particular quality of terror that it grows not just from what is known but from what is suspected. From the gap between the information available and the full scope of the horror, a gap that the imagination fills with something worse than the truth, or sometimes something not quite as bad, but always something that colonizes sleep. By mid-1998, that gap had begun to close in São Paulo, and what was being revealed inside it was shattering. The cases had been accumulating quietly, handled by different precincts, filed in different departments, each one isolated from the others by the ordinary bureaucratic geography of a massive city. A young woman found in the park. Another woman reported missing by her family. A body recovered near the tree line. These incidents sat in their separate folders, investigated with the resources available to overextended departments in a city where violent crime was a daily reality. No one had yet placed them beside each other and seen the shape they made together. That shape, when it finally became visible, was the profile of a serial predator who had been operating freely for over a year. Raquel Mota Rodriguez vanished after accepting Pereira's modeling offer. Her last communication was a phone call to her cousin, a brief, ordinary call, the kind made between people who expect to speak again soon. She mentioned the man she had met, the opportunity that had come out of nowhere, the photo shoot she was heading to. There was nothing in her voice that signaled fear. There was no reason for fear, not yet. Her body was found in the state park a week later. She was strangled. She had been assaulted. The investigation into her death, like the others, proceeded in isolation. Selma Ferreira Queiroz was 18 years old, a basketball player, someone's daughter, someone's teammate, someone who had been building a life with the specific energy of a young person who still believed completely in the future. She met Pereira and did not survive the meeting. Her identity card, the document that would ultimately become the first solid forensic link between the crimes and a specific suspect, was later discovered in a clogged toilet at Pereira's former workplace, partially burned. A piece of evidence that investigators nearly missed entirely. That burned ID card, recovered from plumbing in an office building, would prove to be the thread that pulled everything apart. Victim after victim carried the same story in its basic shape. A chance encounter with a charming man, an offer that sounded legitimate, a journey into the park from which they did not return. The women ranged in age from 15 to their mid-20s. They were students, domestic workers, saleswomen, young women from São Paulo's southern working-class neighborhoods. Women who had learned that opportunity did not always knock loudly, that sometimes it arrived in the form of a stranger at a subway exit with an offer that could change everything. Pereira understood this vulnerability not abstractly but with surgical intimacy. He had studied the economics of hope in working-class São Paulo, and he weaponized it with a precision that was, in its own grotesque way, a kind of dark expertise. The park itself became, in retrospect, a grotesque record of his activity. He buried some victims in shallow graves, covering them with soil and leaf litter and the natural debris of a park's floor. Others he positioned beneath dense undergrowth. The park's geography worked for him. It was large enough that bodies could remain undiscovered for weeks, with thick wooded sections that even regular park visitors rarely penetrated. He knew this. He had assessed the terrain with the calculating awareness of a man who had thought carefully about aftermath. After each killing, he walked out of those trees and returned to the city, returned to his apartment, to his motorcycle, to his routes, to whatever ordinary interactions filled the rest of his hours. He ate, he slept, he went to work, he skated through other parks on other evenings. He was, to anyone who knew him casually, simply a man going about his life. The investigation began in earnest in early July 1998. The catalyst was the near-simultaneous discovery of multiple bodies in the state park, a cluster of recoveries that finally forced the connection that should have been made months earlier. For bodies found within a short period in the same location, this was no longer a series of isolated incidents. This was unmistakably the work of one person. The São Paulo police launched a coordinated investigation, and the media, smelling the magnitude of what was emerging, descended with a ferocity that would both help and complicate the process. By July 15th, a pattern had emerged from witness accounts. Multiple women came forward to report that they had survived encounters with a man matching a consistent description. A man who had approached them at subway stations or in public areas, identified himself as connected to a modeling agency, attempted to guide them into the state park, and revealed something alarming enough that they had broken away and fled. The survivors were precise in their recollections. The man they described was the same man every time. Same approximate age, same approach, same modeling script, same destination. Police artists assembled a composite sketch from multiple accounts, and that sketch began circulating through the city. On July 17th, an anonymous caller provided something more useful than a sketch: a phone number. The caller claimed to know a man who looked like the composite. The number led investigators to Pereira's former workplace, a building in São Paulo where he had briefly been employed. Searching the premises, detectives discovered Selma Ferreira Queiraz's identity card in the damaged toilet. That card was the confirmation they needed, though the DNA evidence that should have accelerated the arrest was about to become one of the most catastrophic investigative failures in the history of the case. Forensic examination of a victim's body in late July had yielded a semen sample, physical evidence that, if properly preserved and analyzed, could have conclusively linked Pereira to the crimes and possibly shortened the period before his arrest. Instead, the sample was mishandled. The São Paulo police laboratory lacked the proper facilities for such analysis, and in the process of attempting to examine the evidence, it was contaminated and rendered inadmissible. This failure, one institutional, one infrastructural, allowed Pereira additional weeks of freedom. It is a detail that the families of his victims have never forgotten and have never fully forgiven, because those additional weeks meant additional danger. Those weeks meant that other women were still at risk as the investigation stumbled. Pereira was aware that the police were getting closer. By late July, the sketch was everywhere, on television news, in newspapers, plastered across subway stations in the very locations where he had hunted. His face, rendered in charcoal approximation by a police artist working from survivor descriptions, stared out from billboards across São Paulo. The city was looking for him, and he ran. He fled south. He traveled to the border regions of Brazil, eventually ending up in Itaqui, a small city near the Argentine frontier, staying with a friend who did not yet know who he was. For 23 days, the manhunt continued across multiple states. The investigation that had initially moved in slow motion was now running at full speed, fueled by a media coverage so intense and so pervasive that his face had become perhaps the most recognized face in Brazil. Every evening news broadcast led with updates. Every newspaper ran new testimony from survivors. The country was transfixed and horrified and furious in roughly equal measure. It was the friend in Itaqui who ended it. The man with whom Pereira was staying watched the evening news, saw the face on the screen, turned to look at the man sitting in his home, and understood with a cold, dropping certainty what he was looking at. He called the authorities. On August 4, 1998, Francisco de Assis Pereira was apprehended near the Brazilian-Argentine border without resistance. He was 30 years old. He had been free for 23 days since the active manhunt began, and for over a year since the first murder. When the police convoy brought him back to São Paulo, a crowd of approximately 200 people was waiting. They were not there to observe. They surged at the vehicles in a fury that law enforcement had anticipated and barely managed to contain. People who had followed this case on television every night for weeks, who had daughters and sisters and wives who took the subway, who walked through parks, who accepted strangers at face value because most strangers do not intend harm. The rage of that crowd was the rage of an entire city that had been violated in a way that went beyond the individual crimes. Its ordinary spaces had been poisoned, its fundamental social trust corroded, Its daughters had been killed by a man whose face looked like safety and whose hands carried death. Police struggled to move Pereira through the crowd and into custody. He was taken to a maximum security facility and placed in solitary confinement immediately. The authorities were explicit about why. Housed in general population, he would not survive a week. 3 days later, on August 7th, Francisco de Assis Pereira called his lawyer. In the presence of witnesses, he told her what he had done. He was specific. He was calm. He described the killings in sequence, one after another, with the careful clarity of someone recounting a series of appointments. His lawyer, Maria Elisa Munhole, emerged from that conversation and stood before reporters with her client's admission still fresh in the air. "My client is guilty," she said. "My client is sick." The following morning, Pereira gave his full statement to police, confirming responsibility for the 8 bodies that had been recovered from the park and adding the confession regarding Isadora Frankel, whose burning and burial he described in detail before leading officers to her remains. When asked why, when the judge, the lawyers, the investigators pressed him for the mechanism of his motivation, Pereira offered an explanation that was at once deeply strange and, from a forensic psychiatric standpoint, entirely consistent with the pattern of what he had done. "I am a person with a good and a bad personality," he said. "Sometimes I am not able to dominate this dark side. I pray, but I cannot resist, and then I chase after women. I wished that they would not go with me into the park. I wished that they would run away." The prayer language, the wish that they had escaped him, the religious vocabulary laid over the description of serial murder like a thin coat of paint over rusted iron. These were the words of a man who had grown up kneeling in church and gone on to bury 11 women in a public park and wanted, somehow, to be understood as a victim of his own nature. It was not a persuasive argument. It was not designed to be. It was simply the only language he had. To understand what Francisco de Assis Pereira did in those wooded corridors of the state park, it is necessary to move past the clinical vocabulary of case summaries, past ligature strangulation and sexual assault and concealment of remains, and into the texture of what actually happened, crime by crime, woman by woman, in the warm Sao Paulo afternoons when the park filled with joggers and families and the distant noise of children playing, and beneath all of that ordinary sound, in the quieter sections where the trees pressed close and the paths narrowed, a man was doing things that the human mind resists fully assembling. He was methodical. This is important. He was not frenzied. He was not operating in a blackout of uncontrollable impulse. He planned. He selected. He prepared. The shoelaces he used as ligatures did not appear by accident. They were a tool he had considered and chosen, something that would not alarm a victim before the moment of assault, something he could carry without raising suspicion, something that left the particular post-mortem evidence characteristic of ligature strangulation. The petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, the bruising pattern around the neck, the broken capillaries that told forensic pathologists with clear scientific certainty exactly how each woman had died. He knew, with the knowledge of someone who had done this multiple times, exactly how much force was required and how long the process took. He did not rush. He had chosen his locations specifically because rushing was unnecessary. The violence he inflicted before death was extensive. The forensic reports, portions of which entered the public record through trial proceedings, documented the nature and severity of the assaults in terms that the presiding medical examiners described as among the most brutal they had encountered in combined decades of practice. He did not simply assault and kill. He used his body as an instrument of extended torture, marking his victims with his teeth in ways that went beyond the biological mechanics of what that implies, leaving impressions in flesh that forensic odontologists would later use as one layer of evidence in the identification process. There were injuries on the bodies that suggested he had bitten pieces of tissue from the most vulnerable parts of the women's bodies, that he had been engaged, in some capacity, in what investigators cautiously described as attempted cannibalism, though the full forensic documentation of this aspect of his crimes remained partially contested, with some experts arguing the wounds were consistent with extreme violence rather than deliberate consumption. The distinction mattered to pathologists. To everyone else reading the reports, the distinction mattered somewhat less than the fundamental fact of what those injuries represented: a level of dehumanization so absolute that his victims had ceased to exist for him as people before they ceased to exist at all. After each killing, he buried what remained. Some graves were shallow, barely enough earth to cover a body, dug with whatever implement was available in the park's terrain, covered with leaves and soil and the natural debris of a wooded floor. Others were more carefully concealed. The body of Isadora Frankel, the 19-year-old student, was the most extreme example of his post-murder behavior. 3 days after killing her, he returned to where her body lay, returned to the scene of the crime deliberately, purposefully, poured gasoline over her remains, and set them alight. He watched the fire. He did not leave until he was satisfied with the level of destruction. And then he walked out of the park again, past the families and the joggers and the children on bicycles, past the vendors at the entrance, past the city that had no idea what was happening inside its own green spaces, and returned to his ordinary life. He testified about this in detail. He described returning to the fire. He described the state of the remains. He described these things with the same flat effect he brought to everything else in his confession. Not boasting, not expressing remorse, simply reporting, as if describing weather conditions or traffic on a route he had traveled. The investigators who took his statement noted the quality of his calm. Police officers who had worked violent crime for years described being unsettled by it. By the particular absence of distress in his account, the absence of the human normalness that manifests even in people confessing to serious crimes. He was not performing composure. He was genuinely undisturbed by what he was describing. This composure and what it revealed about the architecture of his interior life became central to the legal proceedings. His defense, assembled by his attorney, was built on a plea of insanity. The argument was that Pereira was not legally responsible for his actions because he suffered from a profound psychiatric condition that rendered him incapable of understanding the nature or wrongfulness of what he did. His own statement about having a good personality and a bad personality, about praying and being unable to resist, was framed by his legal team as evidence of a dissociative disorder. A fractured self, a man genuinely at the mercy of something within him that he could neither control nor comprehend. The psychiatric evaluations that followed were extensive and contested. Different experts arrived at different conclusions, as they often do in high-profile cases where the stakes on both sides of the question are enormous. Some evaluators found evidence of personality disorder that met legal thresholds for diminished responsibility. Others found a man fully oriented to reality, fully aware of the consequences of his actions, fully capable of planning and executing complex deceptive strategies across a sustained period, none of which was consistent with the kind of dissociation his attorneys were describing. The modeling agency script alone, its maintenance across dozens of separate encounters with different women, its adaptation to different targets, its deployment alongside the acquisition of fake business cards, its consistency over more than a year, argued for a degree of sustained, deliberate cognition that made the blackout of the bad personality narrative extraordinarily difficult to sustain. The public, watching this legal argument unfold through the Brazilian media, had a simpler understanding. They had heard what he had done. They had heard the survivors describe the shift, the moment when the charming scout disappeared and the predator emerged. And in that description they did not hear evidence of dissociation. They heard calculation. They heard the description of a man who wore a mask because he knew the mask was necessary, who maintained it for as long as it served his purpose, and who removed it at precisely the moment he had maneuvered his victim to a location from which it no longer needed to be worn. That is not a man who cannot distinguish right from wrong. That is a man who distinguished it perfectly and chose wrong, deliberately, repeatedly, across 11 documented occasions and 9 additional attempted attacks. The survivors were devastating witnesses. 9 women who had survived encounters with Pereira, who had, through a combination of physical struggle, fortunate circumstance, or whatever grace operates in the margins between survival and death, came forward during the investigation. Their testimony was both legally critical and humanly extraordinary. They described the approach. They described the transit to the park. They described the moment of the transformation and what they had done in response. Screaming, running, fighting, making noise sufficient to attract attention from passers-by, in one case striking him with enough force that he hesitated and she ran and she lived. They described his face in those moments. They described his eyes. They were consistent with one another in a way that not even the most aggressive cross-examination could undermine, because they were describing something they had genuinely experienced and genuinely survived, and the mind retains that kind of experience with a clarity that decades cannot fully erode. One detail that emerged from survivor testimony was particularly notable. Some of the women who had escaped him described how, after the assault began or the threat materialized, he had said things that seemed designed to reassure, things that contradicted the violence he was committing, a verbal performance of normality maintained even as the reality of the situation was catastrophic. This layering, the charming voice maintained over the violent act, was something that forensic psychologists described as evidence of a particular and dangerous form of predatory sophistication. He was not a man who abandoned his mask the moment it was no longer necessary. He maintained it in some form even when the pretense was functionally over, perhaps because the mask had become so fundamental to his identity that he could not fully remove it even in private. Amongst those who knew him from his daily life, neighbors, former colleagues, acquaintances from the motorcycle courier circuit, the reaction to the revelations was almost uniformly shock. Not the performative shock of people who have suspected something and are now playing innocent, but the genuine, unprocessed shock of people discovering that someone they had categorized as safe had been none of those things. A fisherman who had known him said simply that Francisco was the kind of man who could fool any girl. Educated, he said, well-spoken, a regular kind of guy. These assessments, repeated across multiple testimonies from people who had known him in ordinary contexts, built a portrait that was in some ways more disturbing than a description of obvious malevolence. A recognizably evil person can be avoided. A person who presents as educated and well-spoken and regular, that person is everywhere. That person sat next to you on the subway this morning. What was happening in those park corridors during the months of 1997 and 1998 existed in a parallel reality, completely severed from the Francisco that his acquaintances thought they knew, invisible to the city that went on living around it, audible to no one except the women who died and the women who ran. The park held those secrets in its roots and its soil, and the city walked above them every day, and the weekend families spread their blankets on the grass and the children chased each other between the trees and 11 young women lay beneath it all. Each one a life that had been full of ordinary futures before a man with a saint's name and a predator's patience had guided her down a path she should never have been asked to walk. The trial of Francisco de Assis Pereira unfolded before a Brazilian public that had not been so comprehensively engaged by a criminal proceeding in living memory. The media coverage was total. Every development was broadcast, dissected, argued about in households and workplaces and bars across the country. His face had become one of the most recognized faces in Brazil. More recognized, some commentators noted with bleak irony, than the faces of the women he had killed, most of whose names the general public could not recall even at the height of the case's media saturation. This observation, that the perpetrator had achieved a terrible celebrity while his victims remained largely anonymous, became one of the central criticisms leveled at the Brazilian press throughout the proceedings and has remained a live point of discussion in the decades since. The insanity defense, whatever hope his legal team had placed in it, did not hold. The psychiatric assessments that the court ultimately weighted most heavily were those concluding that Pereira was legally sane, that he had known what he was doing, that he had understood it to be wrong, and that he had done it anyway, with planning and persistence and the elaborate social machinery of the fake modeling identity deployed across a sustained predatory campaign. The evidence was simply too coherent, too structured, too indicative of sustained rational intent to support the conclusion that he was operating without awareness. The jury heard about the business cards. They heard about the subway surveillance, the selection of emotionally vulnerable targets, the geographical preparation, the shoelaces. They heard about his flight south when the investigation intensified, a rational, strategic response to threat that directly contradicted the narrative of a man who could not comprehend the consequences of his own actions. He was convicted on all charges: murder, rape, concealment of death, violent indecent assault across multiple counts. The prosecution argued that each crime was a separate offense demanding a separate sentence, and the court agreed. The final figure arrived at by the sentencing judge, 268 years of imprisonment, was not intended as a literal term to be served but as a legal statement, an accounting, a formal acknowledgement of the weight of what had been done. Brazilian law caps the actual imprisonment period at 40 years regardless of the sentence imposed, a provision that existed at the time of the trial and that generated enormous public controversy in the context of this specific case. 268 years for 11 lives taken with deliberate brutality. And the maximum time he could physically spend in a cell was 40 years. The mathematics of that discrepancy were not lost on the families of his victims, who left the courthouse with verdicts that had named his guilt clearly and completely and a sentencing framework that felt, to many of them, like it had used the wrong ruler. He was sent to the Taubaté House of Custody and Psychiatric Treatment in Taubaté, São Paulo, a maximum security facility designed for exactly the population that Pereira represented, housing individuals whose crimes were severe enough and whose risk profile was high enough that integration into general population at ordinary facilities was considered unsuitable. He was placed in conditions of isolation that were as much for his protection as for the institution's security. The general population of Brazil's prison system has its own hierarchy and its own code, and at the very bottom of that hierarchy are individuals convicted of the sexual assault and murder of women. Had Pereira been placed among the general population, his survival would have been measured in days. This proved out almost immediately. In the year 2000, while housed at Taubaté, Pereira was involved in a prison incident in which another inmate, one of Brazil's other infamous criminals, a man named Pedro Rodrigues Filho, who had his own documented history of extreme violence, attempted to kill him during a prison riot. Rodrigues Filho, known within Brazil's criminal culture as someone who targeted child abusers and rapists, reached Pereira during the chaos of the riot and inflicted injuries serious enough to require medical intervention. Pereira survived, but the incident confirmed what authorities had anticipated, that he had no safety in any population environment and would need to live out his sentence under conditions of permanent separation from other inmates. The years passed. The city of São Paulo went on transforming. New subway lines, new neighborhoods rising, the same perpetual noise of 20 million lives. The state park continued to receive its weekend visitors, its joggers and families and children, though for a long time something about it had changed. Something in the atmosphere of those tree-shaded paths that was difficult to name but impossible not to feel for anyone who knew what had happened there. The park had been a graveyard for over a year and had not known it, and that unknowing had its own horror that lingered in the imagination of everyone who understood the full shape of what the case had revealed. The families of the victims navigated their grief in the particular way that the families of murder victims navigate grief, which is to say, incompletely, in fragments, with the constant interference of public scrutiny at some times and public indifference at others. Some families gave interviews. Some declined all contact with media for years. Some were present throughout the trial, and some could not bring themselves to attend. The mother of one victim was reported to have returned to the park after the trial, to the area where her daughter's body had been recovered, and to have stood there for a long time without speaking, standing in the ordinary afternoon light of a place that had become sacred and terrible in equal measure, in the way that sites of unjust death sometimes do. The investigative failures of the case were eventually subjected to formal review and public discussion, particularly following the release of documentary material in subsequent years that brought forward new testimony from survivors and families. The mishandling of the semen evidence, that critical sample rendered unusable by the inadequacy of the available laboratory, became a focus of particular scrutiny. Had that evidence been properly processed, investigators believe an arrest could have come weeks earlier than it did. Whether additional killings occurred during that extended window is a question that cannot be answered with certainty but cannot be dismissed. The investigators who worked the case carried that possibility with them. Some of them, interviewed years later, described it as a professional wound that had never properly healed. The documentary series produced about the case, offering the perspective of survivors and victims' families for the first time with access to unpublished audio recordings, reframed how parts of the Brazilian public understood the story. For decades, the dominant cultural narrative had been structured around Pereira, his psychology, his method, his capture. The women who had survived him had largely been background figures in that narrative, their experiences referenced rather than centered. The documentary pushed back against this structuring, placing the women's voices, their terror, their grief, their survival at the center of the account, and in doing so illuminated a second layer of institutional failure. The degree to which the investigation's delays had been shaped by the same structural machismo that made the modeling lie so effective in the first place. Young women from working-class backgrounds approaching police with accounts of a suspicious man who had tried to lead them into a park. These reports had not always been treated with the urgency they deserved. The pattern had taken longer to coalesce because the individual components of the pattern had not been taken with full seriousness when they first appeared. This critique, leveled not only at the police but at the broader social architecture that had made Pereira's hunting ground possible, resonated in a Brazil that was, by the time the documentary aired, engaged in an extended national conversation about violence against women, about the structures that enabled it, about the specific way that predators like Pereira did not operate in a vacuum but exploited precisely those social dynamics that made young women from certain backgrounds simultaneously visible to the kind of opportunistic false charm he deployed and invisible to the institutional mechanisms that might have protected them. Francisco de Assis Pereira, at the time of this writing, remains imprisoned. He has been imprisoned for more than 2 decades. He has given interviews from prison, interviews that have been, depending on the outlet and the context, explorations of his psychology, his childhood, his religious framework, his understanding of what he did and why he did it. These interviews have generated their own controversy, as such interviews always do. The question of whether giving a serial killer a platform to speak extends his reach and his harm, or whether extracting testimony from him in some form produces understanding that justifies the space he is given to produce it. There are no clean answers to these questions. There never are. What is clear is that the 11 women he killed had no opportunity to consent to the use of their deaths as the material of his notoriety, and that their names, Elisângela Francisco da Silva, Raquel Mota Rodriguez, Selma Ferreira Queiroz, Isadora Frankel, and 7 others whose names have not entered the public record with the same consistency, deserved the permanence of memory that the case eventually gave, however belatedly, to the man who killed them. Elisângela was 21. She had a name given to her by people who loved her. She disappeared in a year when she was building something, when she was at the beginning of whatever her life was going to become. She encountered a man at a place where ordinary people passed each other every day, and he said the right things in the right voice, and she had no way of knowing what he was. None of them did. That was precisely the point. He called himself Francisco de Assis, Francis of Assisi, after a saint who loved all living things and wanted them no harm. He carried shoelaces in his pocket and took women into the trees and did not stop until the city of Sao Paulo finally looked up from its ordinary grief and saw the shape of what was hunting it. 268 years is the sentence. 11 lives is the cost. And somewhere in a maximum security cell in Taubaté, separated from everyone who would kill him on sight, a man who prayed and could not stop and wished his victims had run. That man is still alive. That is, perhaps, the most unsettling sentence of all. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.